So today we're going to talk about disproportionality in autism identification in special education in California. My name is Yu. I'm a postdoc at the Mind and a LAN trainee.
And I'm Jamie Holmes, a special educator and a LAN trainee.
And this is our LAN and HRSA disclaimer. All right, so just to give you an overview of today's presentation, we'll start by talking about some background information, why the issue is important, the aims and objectives of the project, followed by the methods and results. Then we'll end with discussion and implications. Before we talk about the importance of investigating disproportionality, we want to first explain what disproportionality is. Disproportionality in special education refers to the under or over-representation of a given group of students compared to their counterparts regarding service delivery or disability identification. In this project, we focused on race and ethnicity.
And so why is this important, or what drew Yui and I to want to further investigate this? So we know that disproportionality among races in special education is well studied. However, the disproportionality among races in autism identification as special education, especially in California, is less extensively researched. So this disproportionality among races has raised concerns in misidentification, bias, and racial inequity in school services.
There are three goals in this study. First, we want to examine racial ethnic disproportionality in autism identification in special education in the 18-19 school year. Then we examined a 10-year trend in the autism identification in special education. Then we also examined potential inequities in general education inclusion and services received by students with autism by race and ethnicity. State-level data from the 18-19 school year were exported from DataQuest, which provides data and statistics about California's K-12 public educational system. It's publicly available. We use the data to answer the first and second research question. Additional data related to services and general education inclusion were requested from California Department of Education, and we use that to answer the third question. Disproportionality is measured by risk ratio in this study. Risk ratio describes the likelihood of a certain event happening in one group versus another. In general, if the risk ratio is 1, it indicates equal risk or likelihood between the two groups. If the risk ratio is bigger than 1, that means the target racial group is more likely to be identified than other racial groups. If the number is less than 1, that means the target racial group is less likely to be identified than other racial groups. So this table gives you an overview of the number of students in total enrollment for the 18-19 school year and the number of students that were identified with autism by race and ethnicity. For consistency, the race and ethnicity labels used here were from a CDE data system. So the first research question is to look at disproportionality in autism identification. On the y-axis, you can see is the race and ethnic groups, and on the x-axis is the risk53% So the results indicate that multiracial students were over-identified in autism. They were 53% more likely to be identified with autism than all other racial ethnic groups. And comparing to all other racial ethnic groups, Hispanic, Latino students are under-identified. They were 29% less likely to be identified with autism. The second question, we look at the past 10-year trend in autism identification. So we examined 3 time points in the last 10 years, about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and the 18-19 school year. So consistent with the literature that white students tend to be over-identified in autism, over the years, the discrepancies between white and other racial groups have decreased. At least in 18-19 school year, the rate of autism identification in white is comparable to other race and ethnic groups. Hispanic students have been under-identified with autism. The disproportion was more prominent 10 years ago. Although the discrepancies have been narrowing over the past 10 years, Hispanic students are still under-identified with autism in California compared to other groups.
And then when we talk about services, services are simply the types of supports available to people with disabilities. So on this graph, you'll see the different colors are the races, and then the bottom parts are different services available. So the key findings here were that Black or African American students are overrepresented in behavior services and mentoring. Hispanic students were underrepresented in individual counseling and occupational therapy. The multi-ethnic students were overrepresented in speech, occupational therapy, and specialized academic instruction, where the white population were overrepresented in individual counseling. And then we talk about least restrictive environment, just to paraphrase from the IDEA. We know that the LRE means that the students with disabilities are educated alongside their non-disabled peers with support. So again, you see the races as the different colors here. And then these are along the bottom percentages of day that these different races are spending in the least restrictive environment. So the findings were that Black or African American students are overrepresented in 40% of the day or less, meaning they're spending 40% of their day or less in the least restrictive environment. The Native Hawaiian students were underrepresented in 40 to 79% or more than 80% of the day. And the multi-ethnic and white students were overrepresented in spending more than 80% of their day in the least restrictive environment.
Right, so disproportionality in autism identification is found in multiracial group. There are three potential explanations. It's possible that students in this racial group are inappropriately identified, or the other groups are under-identified. That's why the risk ratio is higher. And there is a true difference between the multiracial group and the rest of the racial groups. No studies have examined the multiracial group. In fact, in the disproportionality literature, this group is often excluded. However, the multiracial population is growing 3 times faster than the rest of the country's population. Therefore, more studies are needed in replicating this finding and understanding this finding. Hispanic and Latino students are less likely to be identified with autism. This is comparable to the literature. A study showed that nationwide, Hispanic students were 40% less likely to be identified than white students, and that the finding was 10 years ago. The system often focuses on over-identification because it ties with policies and federal mandates, but it's also important to investigate the under-identified groups. There are 2 hypotheses. It's possible that Hispanic students are under-identified, which means they're probably underserved and are not receiving adequate services that meet their needs. The results of services received presented earlier by Jamie suggested that Hispanic students are less likely to receive certain supports. Another possibility is that they were put into other disability categories instead of autism. We did not show the data, this part of data today, but in the study, we also found that Hispanic Latino students are more likely to receive specific learning disability than other racial groups. It's possible that related service providers may tend to identify or towards the high incident disability because they do not recognize autism or because of some other biases. So this calls for better system and structural support in referral assessment and services. Also provide targeted trainings to prevent inappropriate identification.
And to continue our discussion, for services, our key takeaway for our study today is that Black or African American students are being overrepresented in receiving behavior intervention services. So some of the research suggests that Black children are diagnosed with autism later than white children. Some other research suggests that behavior can be viewed as maladaptive instead of related to autism, like in a sensory integration problem or something like that. So some possible future directions to address this would be obviously to increase autism awareness among Black families, make that screening more accessible, and I think most importantly for me, improve teacher preparation so that teachers can begin to recognize symptoms of autism rather than just seeing a behavior as potentially maladaptive or problematic. And then to continue, we look at the least restrictive environment. So the key findings were that the Black students are spending 40% of their day or less learning with their typically developing peers. And the research again suggests, like I just mentioned, this could be related to Black students as being identified as needing behavior intervention services, or that their behaviors are maladaptive instead of potentially being related to autism. And also that the symptoms related to autism in Black students are misattributed to emotional disturbance and defiance disorders. So where do we go from here? We want to increase awareness and teacher preparation for the implementation of universal design for learning and the multi-tiered systems of support. And in general, this just means if we provide the appropriate supports, all students can access the same great curriculum and instruction and be successful in their classrooms. And then of course, for both of these, we always want to stress the importance of family and student advocacy.
As with many disproportionality studies, we want to acknowledge that this project has its limitations. We were not able to test the potential contributing factors of disproportionality due to the availability of the data. We also want to acknowledge that it's also possible that other factors contributed to the disproportionality we see in addition to race, such as socioeconomic status, English learner status, level of diversity of school, which all have been shown in the literature to impact disproportionality in special education. We would like to thank our mentors and collaborators throughout this project.
Jamie, in the data, and I just missed this, in the data that you were talking about in terms of least restrictive environment and the types of services, were those only for the students who had been diagnosed with autism, or those were for kids that were all developmental disabilities?
Those were all developmental disabilities, but what we did do, Len, is we did, Yui and I went through the data, as you can imagine from CE, it was extensive. So what we did is she had kind of asked me to pull out some of those services that are most likely going to be attributed to with the autism disability. So like language and speech and SLD. So we couldn't obviously talk about all the services.
Okay, and then I guess just another question or comment. I thought it was really interesting. Maybe you could talk about how you interpret this, if I remember correctly, that the one category of services in which the white students were overrepresented was in individual delivered services relative to the other groups.
I think it was.
I have my own interpretation of that, but
yeah.
I mean, I want to hear yours.
Yeah, honestly, the hardest part in presenting some of this data was to keep my bias out. So because I've been in the field and I've seen this, and so my interpretation of that is that just greater accessibility to services, so more awareness, and then again, maybe that bias comes in from the teachers, depending on different things. Perhaps the student needs counseling instead of behavior intervention services. So okay. I don't know if that's what you were thinking.
Great, thank you.